to color, many layers of color. And when you think about color, usually we just think about those primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. We don't really think about color as a multi-dimensional piece of vocabulary, but you should. And when you talk about color, there is the hue, and that is what the color looks like. The hue might be red, blue, green, yellow, orange, whatever we want to call that color, where we have a name for that. Now we want to talk about more than just what we call the color, because you may say purple and you might mean lavender. Color has a lot of variety in it. So let's talk a little bit about how we get all that variety in the color. The hue of a color can be changed by the saturation or the desaturation of the color. That means how much of the pure color is present and how much of that pure intense color is not present. So you go from a fully saturated color to a range where you can have the desaturated color, where the intensity is taken out. So when you think about the hue of a color, the name of it, then you want to think linearly on how much intensity of the color is present. Is it super, super intense in that color, or is it more desaturated, a little bit more grayed out of that color? So first we have that hue, the name of the color, and then we have the saturation. How intense is the color? When we're talking about color, the value of the color is very important. How light or how dark is that color? So we just talked about the saturation on the grayscale. Now we need to talk about value. Now value could be the complete version of white or black. So the amount, the value of that color, how much white is present or how much black is present. So when we get into the value, now we're sort of talking about, is it a darker or is it a lighter value? So we have saturation, which is the intensity of that color, and then value is a darker or lighter version of that color. As we talk about that lighter or darker version of that color, often we speak about that in terms of a shade. So if something is a shade of a color or a hue, the shade would be darker. That is when black is added to that original intense color, and then it gets darker as it goes along. So that's when black is added to a color, we get a shade. Now on the opposite version of that, if white is added to a color, then we get a tint of that color. So it can become lighter. So we can take a real intense pure red and turn that into a pink, a really lighter version of that hue of red. By adding white, you start to get a shade or a tint of that color. So if you add black, it's a shade. If you add white, it's a tint. And now we can start to talk about how color starts to move along a three-dimensional platform where we have the intensity of the color saturated or desaturated, and then we have the light or dark of the color where we add white and we get the tint, or we add black and we get that shade. So now you can start to think about color in sort of more dimensional terms, not just the plain version on the color wheel, but now we start to manipulate color and think of it dimensionally. Okay, so now that we're thinking about that color dimensionally, let's look what happens when we start to turn that wheel onto its side. So it's not just a ring of color sitting straight up and down looking at us in the faces. It starts to bend back and becomes a plane. Then we add that layer of saturation, and you'll see that with one color here, which I'm just going to show you where one color starts to come out with that saturation. But imagine if all the colors were coming off their spot in the color spectrum with the saturation, you would start to see how color can pull dimensionally. Then we add the value, and that's where we get the light to the dark. So now we have the purest white at the top, and the dark black at the bottom. So you can kind of see how you turn color on its side. The color wheel is one dimension with saturation and hue, and then we have that value that comes into play. And now we can start to really think about color as a dimensional item that really starts to move in several ways. And it's really about getting that depth of the color in your color palette. Think about how those colors are combining together, how they're mixing to make further colors. And then you want to think about the depth of the colors. What kind of saturation do I want? What kind of light or dark do I want? That's when you really start to get the magic of the color happening. Now, you may not see this right away, and that's totally okay. It takes some time to play with color. You'll start to add it in, you'll start to play with it, and you'll start to manipulate the color and textures and the depths of the colors to get really a true palette for your wardrobe. But reviewing the purpose, the places of the color, the roles that they have, that is the most important part in understanding how color works. Really just getting that vocabulary to a spot where you understand it.